discussing, where the economic zones in the Soviet Union should be opened up, how the diplomatic crisis in China should be resolved. I mean, people who just routinely take it upon themselves to run the world for the rest of us. There's a deeper level. This is a slight turn on this, but there's a deeper level on this idea, to this idea of pragmatism, which I was thinking about because I was thinking about yesterday's lecture and how it was a lot of information. And I wondered what other lectures might be like that would be so full of information. And then I reviewed in my mind the history of art from the point of view of realism. Realism is this funny thing where people painted on their bodies and scarified themselves and painted in styles that have been rediscovered in the 20th century. Impressionism, symbolism, abstract expressionism. We see all this in the cave paintings in Africa and in southern France and so forth and so on. But once the Greeks got their camp in order, they set off in this funny direction, which was they wanted marble to be like flesh. They did not want to symbolize the human form or evoke it or make an image of it. They wanted to find out what it was by duplicating it exactly. And they were able to do this and produced, these things, which I don't know if any of you have visited the museum at the Parthenon or the Metropolitan in New York City. You get it from this Greek stuff. I mean, I think even if you're pretty lumpen, you suddenly understand what art is about, why people pay $11 million for a piece of marble. Because what real genius is, you have to put out your hand to satisfy yourself that this is not real breathing human flesh. And these faces, have minds behind them. And when you stand and look in them, you say, so this is what the thing about Greece is all about. Now I understand that some kind of magical thing. Well, Eleusis was this central focus for the mystical intentionality of the Greek mind. This ties in with this thing that William Blake said about attend the minute particulars. Remember, we talked about that, he said this was the basis of poetry, and understanding reality was attention to the minute particulars. So there is a way of opening beyond symbols, beyond language, and we call it realism, but we don't recognize it for what it is. I mean, realism is thought of as another ism, but it isn't another ism, it's an ontos of a completely different order. There are isms and there is realism. And realism seeks to go beyond isms, to go beyond language, to go beyond expectation and the forward-moving net of language, and to present us with something which is, shocking and infinitely deep and beyond contravention. This is the thing. And so this thing has been carried forward mostly in art, mostly as an intuition. It's not clear to me that it's ever been exactly articulated as a philosophy, but this is what the light of Caravaggio and, the recessional distances of the brothers Van Eyck and, Turner and all of this stuff, it's a going into the stuff of the world without preconception, attempting, the great discovery that shadows are not always black. Somebody had to look to figure that out, and then to embody it against the flow of all understanding. The discovery of perspective is this peculiar episode in the history of Western thought that is never discussed sufficiently. We are asked to believe that somewhere between the death of Giotto and the death of Michelangelo, European human beings suddenly understood that things got smaller the further away from you they were, and therefore created the world of pictorial space that we have inhabited ever since. Well, you know, in an earlier lecture I told the story about how Thomas Aquinas proved his sanctity by being able to look at open books and then later tell what he had read without ever moving his lips. This was silent reading, and it was viewed as a miracle by his contemporaries because they all had to vocalize while they read. Well, this is a similar kind of phenomenon, this sudden popping into existence of the recessional distance and the whole set of understandings that allows us to navigate three-dimensional space. What is happening here? Does language make way for this stuff? Is it biological? Is it just happen to happen during the Italian Renaissance? How can a convention of painters of a courtly class become a way of inhabiting space and time for the entire population of an ancient continent? It defies understanding. What is actually being tracked is some kind of recent readjustment of the information processing values in the human brain-mind system. And these things are very close to the surface and very easily perturbed. You know, Julian Jaynes, in his book about the bicameral mind, felt that there had been a major shift in the construction of consciousness at the time of Homer. That before Homer, people didn't exactly have egos. They were sort of like soulless beings which, when put under pressure by like a tight situation in battle, would have a magical voice speak to them in their head and tell them what to do. And they called this their demon, their familiar, their titulary animal or god, and then he felt that this autonomous function of the psyche later became incorporated into the larger structure of the human mind as the ego, and that what we use as an ego was once a god. This is the depths to which we have fallen, that we, have shackled a god into the service of managing our portfolios. It's a principle that's very old in nature. For instance, mitochondria, which are the powerhouses of the human cell, are these little enzymatic engines that were originally free-swimming bacteria that have been, through evolution, incorporated into the dynamics of larger structures and embedded there, and now their energy is all channeled to the purposes of the cell, and they have their own genetic material and everything. They are clearly relict organisms embedded in cytoplasmic material. So this principle of incorporation of the autonomous element to enrich the original structure is pretty well there. An instance of that I'm interested in is the pregnancy of language in these Amazonian tribes that are using Banisteriopsis type hallucinogens. I mean, something is trying to happen. This language is just subvisible, and the whole mystery that haunts the culture is that it isn't always subvisible. That, on good Saturday nights, when everything is clicking, they can actually drag out this stuff from another dimension and play with it. And you just wonder, the beta-carbolines are so closely related to endogenous brain chemistry, and so is the DMT that it's running on. I mean, clearly these people are rubbing up against an evolutionary interface spot, a place where human ability, human neural processing, human signal-making functions are bubbling together with the potential of a sudden perturbation to a higher and previously unanticipated state of order. And I think that it has something to do with this projective imagination through acoustical sound, that this idea has haunted the human mind, and certainly the Western mind, through the tradition of Pythagoreanism and the Orphic religions, this tradition of using sound to perform magic and transcend levels and see into the fabric of nature. And what's going on in these Amazon situations where, the conventions of modern physics mean nothing. Nobody's speaking English. Nobody knows about the periodic table or Newton or any of that. They're operating in another world. And what they're doing is, in these states of intoxication, projecting this phenomenon for which we don't even have a word. I mean, telepathy is a thin notion. Telepathy is, I think, you hear me think. That's not what this is. This is that these people can project whole scenarios of three-dimensional phenomena that are part of a group perception that is not operating under the will of individuals, but that is somehow the élan vital, the life force of the group itself. I mean, we don't have a sociological vocabulary for this stuff. Anthropologists talk about manas and magic and morphogenetic fields and this and that and the other hand. But this is reductionism, because the living fact of this stuff is pretty astonishing.
So, to change the subject, you mentioned the heretics in your talk this afternoon, that Syrian sect, was it?
The Mandaeans.
The Mandaeans. And we talked earlier, before coming in, also of the uses of heresy and your passion for them. I wonder if you'd link that to what we should
heresy.
do. Link that to what action to take.
Well, heresy is always safe if you're scripting your life for the history books. You just can't go wrong as a heretic, because they're always vindicated. The trouble is there can be some rough spots along the way. A favorite heretic of mine is Giordano Bruno, who some of you may know about, who was burned at the stake as the price of his commitment to heresy. Bruno discovered the infinity of the universe. That's what he discovered. He looked into the night sky and was the first person in Europe to say, those aren't adamantine shells of Aristotelian crystalline spheric material. Those are stars. Those are suns like our sun, and they must go on forever. It opened before him. And he was burned at the stake. The period that is so rich in heresy and has been a great inspiration for me is the Hellenistic syncretism that follows upon the classical period in Greece and the rise of Roman power, and at the same time ferment in the Jewish end of the Mediterranean to create. And all kinds of things were happening, actually. There were gymnosophists coming from India teaching yoga in the 2nd century BC in Rome. And there were, Egyptian followers of Thoth and Isis. And there were Docethians and Montanists and followers of Simon the magician. And these were there a vast spectrum of cults, ranging from Orthodox Jewish cults, such as the Nabateans, and the Zealots, and presumably the Mandaeans that I mentioned earlier. And then there were Jewish mysticism infected with Platonic ideas, Philo-Judaeus, Apollodorus, Musaeus, all these minor philosophers were teaching. There were Pythagoreans, there were atomists, and the most interesting of these were proto-Christian, neo-Christian, pseudo-Christian, crypto-Christian sects that were competing with what eventually became Christianity. Some of you may know of this sect that did some of the Dead Sea Scrolls, the Nabateans, who lived outside of Jerusalem and down in the Dead Sea. These were the people that James Pike was investigating when he died in the Negev. A few years ago, well, actually over many years, was a very important manuscript find in 1948 at a place called a Greek Orthodox monastery called Chenoboskion in Upper Egypt that was on a much older site called Nag Hammadi. And out of the ground at Nag Hammadi came 43 codices that were by groups of scholars coordinated worldwide, translated through the 50s and 60s and 70s. This is now available as the Nag Hammadi Library. And it's very, very interesting stuff, because this stuff went into the ground AD 270. So the later bishops, the patristic recensionists, the diddlers and fiddlers and all of that were kept away from it. Nobody had seen this stuff since AD 280. So it was very, very interesting. Of the 53 texts, 41 were unknown in any other version. Of those that were known, there was some of the late Plato. There was portions of Matthew, but what was interesting were these previously unknown texts, some of which were very close to gospel type material, a gospel according to Philip, the second known version of the Gospel of Philip, a gospel according to Thomas, the doubter, my favorite guy. But more interesting is the less pseudo-Christian material, this exegetical and mystical material that just takes off, that is proto-Hermetic. Some of it shows traces of Indian philosophies, transmigration of souls, yogic practices. Some of it reads almost like Maria Sabina's mushroom chants. There's one text called The Voice of the Thunder that has a meter and a rhythm that is precisely Maria Sabina. So Gnosticism is the general banner under which all of this stuff can be placed. Gnostics believe the central tenet of Gnosticism, and it's hard to put this across because modern Gnostics are such cheerful people, but they've forgotten their real roots. The central perception of Gnosticism, no matter how you slice it, is that we don't belong here, that we are strangers, that something terrible happened, and that accounts for why we're here, that we were destined for a much better deal, and something went terribly, terribly wrong. It takes different forms. Some Gnostic mythologies are fairly straightforward. Some are fairly Baroque. The one that I enjoy is one of the more Baroque ones. The 2nd century Gnostic bishop Valentinius had this notion that there were 36 archons. They are demons of progressively lessening power that interpose themselves between man and a true vision of God. And the last of the archons, the 36th archon, was Sophia, and the only of the archons that was female. There's a tremendous sexual ambivalence in Gnosticism, which we can talk about, which is resolved in different ways. But anyway, the 36th archon is Sophia. She looked upward toward the higher God and saw him bring forth creation, of which she was the final manifestation. And in her heart, an avarice grew, a wish to create in the same manner as the highest and hidden All-Father. And she brought forth, it's described as an abortion. She self-fertilized herself. She did not understand the requisites of creation, and she turned inward into herself, and she brought forth a monstrosity. And this monstrosity is the God of the Old Testament, Yahweh, Jehovah. And when she saw what she had done, that she had brought forth this monstrosity, she flashed through a whole bunch of emotions very quickly. Horror, guilt, rage, fear, agony, like that. And these emotions of the errant Sophia condensed as the material world over which Ildabuath was then made Lord. So the entire material universe is seen as the condensed emotional debris of the horror of the 36th archon upon witnessing her own creation, who is then made God over this universe. Well, even though this is this really bad scene, it still, nevertheless, has this extremely tenuous connection to the highest and hidden All-Father in the form of what is called the scintilla, the spark, the soul spark of divinity. So then the goal of Gnostics, born into this unfortunate world, is to gather the light together, to save the light. The light is defiled by its presence in the world of material existence, and the light must be gathered. Well, so then the central soteriological concern, that means the central salvational concern of Gnosticism, is how shall we gather the light? And their whole theology then is, what is the light? How should we gather it? And once we have it, what do we do with it? And then there were various answers. I mentioned the sexual tension inside Gnosticism. It took two forms, both wild extremes. In one case, Gnostic hermeneutics reasoned along the following lines. Life is defiled, the light is defiled by the material universe. Therefore, we should withhold entry of the light into matter. Therefore, we must be celibate. We must have no children. And in some cases, this took the form of saying, and we sanction no form of sexual union which could lead to procreation. So they were kinky in that style. The other direction that they took was extreme celibacy. Just simply no sexual contact whatsoever. And then the third option, and these options had differing percentages of loyalty as Roman society underwent exterior transformations. The third Gnostic stance was, man is divine. We are of the light, and nothing in the universe of Ildabuath can pollute the light, for it is of a higher order, and therefore we can do anything we want. Yes, so you could be a Gnostic and line up for scourges and heavy dieting, or you could line up for total libertinism and eating and drinking anything you want and any kind of... So this was the spectrum, and this was, of course, very baffling to Christian morality. But Christianity has an incredible debt to Gnosticism. I mean, the Gospel of John and Revelations. I mean, this whole bit, in the beginning was the Word, this notion of the going forth of the Word, this is thoroughly Gnostic. And the struggle between light and darkness, you know, the light shines in the darkness, and the darkness comprehended not. This is essentially the Manichaean thing, which is a form of Gnosticism. Manichaeanism is a dualistic Persian religion that had great sway in Persia through this slightly later phase. Mani was its prophet. Mani was a Mandaean. His father was a priest in the Mandaean faith. Well, why talk about this so much? Well, I don't know. Permission for heresy is never a bad idea. And I think this is an important issue which is not resolved. I mean, we are all love bunnies of one sort or another. But what do you do about this thing? Are we of the earth? Is it our charge and our destiny? Or are we from another place? You can't have it both ways. This is a pretty clear division. What are we to be? Are we to integrate with nature? Or are we to transcend it through an act of conjuration out of the self, which is what culture is? I mean, apparently we have made the choice, and all we're doing now is the philosophical dotting of the I's. Our commitment to technology is thoroughly Gnostic. Our commitment to we believe that nature is something that withholds secrets from us, that we must wrest the secrets of nature from it in order to somehow complete ourselves. And, modern Gnosticism plays all this down. Modern Gnosticism is existential and capitalizes more on the idea of abandonment. They're less interested in the program for returning to the higher and hidden All-Father, and much more interested in talking about how we are abandoned by the All-Father, and therefore what a drag it is and what can we do about it. So that people like Heidegger are thoroughly Gnostic in their thinking. I mean, anybody who is not... Because you see, what Gnosticism denied was the presence of God in the world. You need to understand that it was an article of faith of Gnostics that this is really a long way from God, that we are really off, way, way out, over, away from it. And Christianity preserves this dualism in the eternality of evil, in the idea that, there isn't a final fusion. They preserve the distinction down to the last knell of recorded time. So that's a thoroughgoing dualism. But my approach to this kind of thing is basically Jungian. I mean, that's where I got my interest in all of this material. See, I think that what we're always seeing is psyche, that we're always seeing a mirroring of the intentionality of ourselves to concretize consciousness, to put a name on it. And so I have called myself at times a noetic archaeologist. What I like to do is go and dig up, not pot shards and glass beads, but ideas. Old ideas that have been under the dirt a long, long time. And this is what I essentially did here with the I Ching. And Gnosticism is another boneyard, and alchemy is another boneyard, and the Maya are another boneyard, and ancient Hawaii is another. And I love to go into these things and draw conclusions, It's all very pregnant with intention toward the person who comes to it with an open mind. I mean, everything wants to speak, everything wants to guide us. I haven't talked much about it, but I always think there are so many ways in which it's true that it would have been so much different if Aldous Huxley had guided things through the turmoil of the 1960s. Aldous Huxley was, you know, a British intellectual, a novelist, a social critic, but even before he wrote The Doors of Perception, he wrote a book called, or an essay called The Art of Seeing. And, you know, this was gospel as far as my mother was concerned. I mean, my mother was an extraordinary woman. I don't know how she had the intuition to be into the things that she was into. But it's this thing about seeing. And this goes back to what I was saying about realism, training the eye. What these Renaissance people and these Greek people were doing with the recessional distances and the nudes was they were really looking. They were really seeing. They were not painting stories that they were telling in their minds, but they were actually paying attention to texture and shadow and light. And this learning to see, taught very early, is a tremendous inoculation against cultural viruses, value viruses and linguistic viruses, because, and you don't see if you grow up with television. You know, television is something that you look at. It's like it has this flat quality. It is undemanding. Everything has been stripped of depth before it ever reaches you, even to be offered for your perception.
What do you think about the more Cubist? Once Picasso brought in Cubism and changed the entire direction of art away from realism and into a different view of seeing things, from many facets, and broken down into other, and in a sense from other dimensions.
Well, I'm surprised at my stirring defense of realism, because I'm much more sympathetic to my interest in art history was always 20th century art, and what I loved was the upheaval and the screw you attitude. I mean, I was thinking today as I thought about this lecture about myself as a 13-year-old kid and who were my heroes. And, it wasn't baseball players and it wasn't even astronauts. It was Jackson Pollock. And, that's what I wanted to be. I wanted to be a kid from Wyoming who went to New York and drank hard in bars and produced paintings that 99% of everybody hated, and that I would insist were in fact works of staggering genius, and I would triumph, and it was this whole thing. I mean, I was living in a small town in western Colorado, you have to understand. I mean, the notion of a man hurling paint at a canvas, it just outraged the inner Amish of the place where I was living. No, I think all of this stuff is very important, and that art, I didn't mean to suggest a value judgment in favor of realism over other artistic styles, because I think by the time the 20th century came around, realism had grown self-defeating. It was something which had to be pried loose and perfected. And for me, I think it's probably perfected in Jan van Eyck, the altarpieces of the Van Eyck brothers, or Caravaggio, or, by the time you get to Velasquez and the Mannerists, something else is happening. It's like they've overshot the mark. With Mannerism, it's getting weird. It looks at first like realism, but then you realize that bizarrely morbid distortions are taking place, and that what is seeping upward into the realist canvas is the unconscious, and that these odd intimations of sadomasochism and mania and all this stuff that you're getting off of this stuff, it's not you, it is there. They're trying to make it like that. And the Mannerists set the stage for full permission to push off into then Romanticism, really. The evocation of emotion through the manipulation of image, of natural image, but it's really, the thinking is not realistic, the thinking is allegorical. Romanticism always tends toward allegory. That's why these islands sucked at by blackened water and covered over in fallen gardens and crumbling ruins, these don't exist anywhere. This is not reportage of the natural world. These are dreamscapes of a morbid imagination. Okay, well, so then it all runs out in the 19th century. I mean, for my money, 19th century art is pretty dismal. It's very much of the Academy. In France, you've got Watteau and Fragonard, and in England, you have, Reynolds and all of this stuff going on, until this romantic morbidity gives rise to, out of the recrudescence of that movement come people like Redon and Moreau, French symbolists. And this is consequent upon, interestingly enough, an interest in psychedelic drugs. These people are smoking hashish and drinking absinthe and are familiar with opium and this kind of thing. And they set the stage then for the pre-Raphaelite thing, and which I don't know whether you view that as design or art, but simultaneously Impressionism is happening. And Impressionism, strangely enough, is like art in the service of the realist ideal again, but in strange clothing. Because what they were trying to do was shed this academic, allegorical, symbolic stuff and just show light. It was an effort to do that. And it gave permission for, another thing then. So there were two simultaneous tendencies there. The Impressionists with their concern with what the eye sees and light, and then operating in the background stuff like the pataphysicians and the Dadaists later, where it was all about, again, the unconscious and bringing that in. The same tendency which had infected mannerism then came in as surrealism in the 20th century, and because of Freud and Jung and all this stuff. So I think that the whole history of 20th century art is a reaction against morbid romanticism, which was probably a pretty good thing to overthrow. But I saw people like Pollock, or specifically Pollock, as in a sense realists, in that what they were showing us was chaos.
That's sort of the evolution of an artist as you gain more and more ability, you get past the symbols and you get into realism. But then you take the realism and you use it as you can use it as a fiction in a sense. So you can do what the Mannerists did and go into a dream state, so it becomes a language, a visual language that can describe things that our words can't.
Well, Pollock made an immense intellectual journey, because he started out he was born in Cody, Wyoming. This is a strike against you in the first place. And he studied art under Thomas Hart Benton, who was the absolute epitome of the American realist school. If you don't know Thomas Hart Benton, he did WPA murals of women bringing jugs of cider to men in the fields at noontime. In other words, glorification of the American working class in a style almost reminiscent of the Mexican mural style of Diego Rivera. Pollock came out of that, He used a screwdriver, was his major instrument, and he stood back or stood over his canvases on stepladders and whipped paint across them and built up these layered things that were just amazing. And what they were the abstract expressionist equivalent of an atomic explosion. This is what the 50s was all about. So realism came to mean looking into many strange parts of reality.
You know, at what point does the dream get integrated to where it's us? At the point where we control it like we control our voice in our head?
Well, we have this admiration for the Australian style of relating to the dream time. But if we continue to develop our technology the way we do, we have our own dream time. It's watching television, and it's probably going to deepen. I mean, I think that our appetite for sensation and entertainment is driving that industry to develop itself almost more rapidly than any other. And because it's all mythic, what's on television. Television is not reality. Television is the cultural myth about reality. This is where the archetypes in the American unconscious are to be met, tough cops and jiggle blondes and all these people that are in our cultural mass programming are running around in there. Oh, it's terrible. It's just that we have such a tacky set of images. It could be epical. Imagine if we were 19th century Germans. Television would be like Wagner.
Just did it. I wanted you to switch and do a similar kind of historic analysis that you did for Gnosticism and for art and music as well. All the shifts.
Well, I don't claim to know a lot about music.
What did Wagner represent?
Well, Wagner comes late.
What's that? Late.
What I would say about this, I think music is very important. We said in here on a different day that architecture was frozen music, and therefore music must be unfrozen architecture. And what did you mean? What could you say about that? This Pythagorean thing, this very old thing, this discovery of these apparently natural relationships that are very mysterious between the plucked strings, so that if you stretch gut between bone antlers and you pluck certain strings, other strings in a perceived to be natural relationship called an octave will also vibrate in harmony. This is the key concept here, harmony. People saw this, and Pythagoras, or apocryphally, what Pythagoras did was he filled glass tubes with water, and when he had two glass tubes tuned so that they were an octave apart, it was observed that the amount of water in them could be expressed as a mathematical ratio. Well, this touches on a very mysterious aspect of things that nobody quite understands, and you don't even hear people talk about it because it's so problematic. And that is this: why does mathematics have something to do with nature? Why does mathematics have anything to do with nature? Think about what mathematics is. Mathematics is the operations you can perform on numbers. Well, nature isn't, you don't see numbers. And yet, this has been the fundamental insight of the Western mind that has allowed miracle after demonic miracle to be conjured out of nature. The discovery of the curious parallelism between nature and operations performed on numbers. Well, it comes out of this Pythagorean religious mentality, which observed, these ratios and related them to the sounds and said, well then, there can be a mathematical theory of music, and then they observed regularity in other phenomena. The stars had long been observed to be regular. Well, so then they began to think in terms of regular, perfect things versus irregular, mundane things. And in this climate, Platonism was able to come into being, and Platonism makes an absolute division, between the world of archetypal perfect things and then the lower slice of reality. Music was carrying all of this along, and if you're interested in ancient music and its impact on ancient philosophy, these books by MacLean, The Myth of Invariance, is one of them. It's a study of mathematics in Plato and the Rig Veda, and it's all musical mathematics. They were studying proportion, harmony, relationship. Now notice that in this situation where the string is plucked and the other strings in octaves above and below vibrate, this is a very cogent demonstration of action at a distance, something which is very troubling even in modern conceptions. But it's a very cogent demonstration of action at a distance. It shows that there need not be a connecting medium for force and activity to be transmitted across space. In other words, it is an argument for magic, for etheric influences and this sort of thing. And so then the theory quickly grew that obviously then the way to influence these things was through music, through sound, and theories of tone grew up. And the 7 planetary bodies that were familiar to the astrologers were connected to 7 tones, and then a correspondence was recognized between 7 metals, and a map of the world was slowly constructed that had music at its ultimate basis. There's a wonderful book that deals in part with all of this that some of you may know, called Hamlet's Mill. Hamlet's Mill is the story of this very old myth that occurs all over the world about how somebody has a mill, a little grinder, and somebody else steals it, and then the thief rows across a body of water with the mill in a boat, and the mill sinks the boat, and the mill is grinding out salt. And this is, in one version, the explanation for why the ocean is salty. It's because off the coast of Norway, in that place called the Maelstrom, that is the mill, and down at the bottom it is grinding out salt. And Giorgio de Santayana, who wrote this book, Hamlet's Mill, with Hilda von Dechend, talked about it as a myth of a movement of the stellar machinery, that stars which were near the pole moved beneath the surface of the sea, and the mill was lost, and a whole world age was thrown into confusion. And a lot of the discussion of this hinges on looking at Rig Vedic and Platonic musical theory. These ayahuasca songs in the Amazon are visually intended. They are to be seen, not to be heard. I mean, the people criticize them that way, they critique them that way. Voice is primarily a vehicle imagined to affect color vision. And, if we could see what we meant, the ambiguity would leave our intention to communicate with each other. This would be a kind of telepathy, the seeing of meaning. Well, when you think about what meaning is, there's no reason why it should be processed through hearing. It's not particular, it has nothing particularly to do with hearing. Meaning is a much fuller and richer signal than hearing. Why shouldn't it be conveyed visually? When I look at this room, I'm not listening to it, I'm looking at it, and the meaning of what is going on comes to me through my eyes. This is how the meaning of the world presents itself. We don't listen to the world, but we listen to speech for its meaning. And this closes us toward many things and pushes us in a certain direction.
We don't have any medium that we can physically produce, other than our electronic medium, that we can easily produce a visual image to share.
Print. When we read.
But you mean conversationally and instantaneously, right?
Like you can with speech.
Well, yeah, this is where you have to take drugs to push the argument further, because what you have to hypothesize is that it might be possible to generate an acoustical hologram with your voice or something like that. In other words, when you take ayahuasca with these people in the jungle and you see the songs, the reason you see the songs is because you're loaded. Well, how loaded do you have to be to see the songs would be a good question for researchers to ask. Maybe you don't have to be overtly stoned at all. Maybe you could have a sub-threshold amount of harmine in your system, and when they started singing, lo and behold, here it would appear.
Is it not possible, theoretically possible at any rate, that once this has happened in your system, whatever this has gone through physiologically and whatever other way, that the path is there, that there would be a way to learn that thing, that you could do it on Thursday morning?
On the natch.
Isn't that what your brother was trying to do with the
Yeah.
sounds in the Amazon?
See, there is something going on here, because in the pineal gland, harmine is produced. And DMT is produced in the brain too. So the chemical prerequisites for the brain state are there. I think the first meeting we held, I talked about the fact that people who have smoked DMT then report months, years later, dreams in which they smoke DMT, and it happens in the dream. Okay, this is a major piece of evidence. This means it can happen, that it's not chemically exogenous. But then the question is, how the hell do you get to the same place as you are in a dream when someone passes you the glass pipe? But the very fact that it can happen, and so then, so it lies very close to the level, to the level of consciousness, you see. And these people who've been in the Amazon all these 20,000 years that we've been calling primitive, while we've been inventing technology and doing all this other stuff, what they've been doing is every Saturday night exposing themselves to a linguistic catalyst. Well, so we think, well, maybe they have a really far-out language. No, they don't have a really far-out language. They have an entirely ontically transformed linguistic ability that we don't even have a suspicion of, that it is learnable. And I don't know, because they put so much stress on this diet, it's very clear that they are diddling towards something. They have a goal that they're trying to maximize. There is something there that they want to get. And when you meet many ayahuasqueros and take it with many of these guys, the guys who make the good stuff are all alike. They have this weird aura. They have a voice thing that is hard to describe. But you know the concept of voice in Dune, where there was a way to just drop down a register and speak in a way that people could not resist because you set the vibe in this certain way. These ayahuasqueros have this, and they have Yes, it's something so outside our cultural value system that we can hardly realize what we're doing with, because how many of us would go there, and then how many of us would go there and go deep enough, and then take the drug with these people, and then be enough free of your own stuff to pay attention to what they were putting out, and then to keep it enough together to create a description that you could bring back later. So, you know, it's just, the world is not empty of the new and the novel, these frontiers. This is how I ended the lecture yesterday. There are just frontiers and frontiers and frontiers in chemistry and anthropology and ethnography, and some of it we're actually talking about, you know, the transformation of the human form, and not through technology, but in a cleaner, biologically, a way which celebrates natural process and celebrates the vitality of the minded portion of the planet. It's an attunement, not this Gnostic thing which I evoked for you, which is, you know, people used to say of my grandfather, where he'd been was so-so, where he was hell, and where he was going was paradise.